have no idea what I'm doing here. I'm scared of heights. I can't play the fiddle. And we're anyway getting canceled because today we talk about the strife of Israel and Palestine and anti-Semitism rising across Europe. If you are an ultra-rich auto manufacturer, are you doomed to be an insane conspiracy theorist? Because there seems to be a tendency there.
A lot of people tend to mystify Jewish culture, Jewishness, not necessarily with a negative intent at all.
Most of the governments are more sensitive to anti-Semitism than to racism.
Yeah.
Like you can say a lot against Muslims, but you can't publicly say as much against Jews. And this, I think, causes the competition between these two minorities.
Why does anti-Semitism in these new different forms and guises generally endure and can be used as a political weapon?
Hello and welcome back to Standard Time, the talk show. Here we jump right into the fire of societal questions and we don't shy away from hard topics. I'm your host, Reka Kinga-Pop, and in each episode I'm joined by guests from all over Europe. We release new episodes every second Thursday, so don't miss out. Hit the subscribe button and set 23 to 40 alarms so you never miss an episode. By the way, you can also watch the show or listen to it in a podcast format on Display Europe. And don't forget to turn on the subtitles in one of the 15 languages. The public discourse on Palestine and Israel is extremely tense all across Europe and tinted with local political tropes. Let's make no mistakes, this has been the case for decades, but since the escalation of violence last October, the debate erupted with new fervor and has been really toxic. Now, it would be foolish to suggest that we can do justice to this ongoing conflict in a half-hour talk show. I'm foolish, but not that foolish. What we can do, however, is inspect the underlying reasons why these discussions are so charged and why they seem to really run in circles. People often feel like they are walking on eggshells and can only say the wrong thing. Why is that? Let's be honest. Anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim racism form a double helix across European history. These ideologies have informed the politics of the Christian parts of Europe for over 1,000 years and have always been used to galvanize fragmented polities against a shared enemy, often in the form of a scapegoat. This historical baggage also affects those who try to avoid falling into the trap of hate politics. Today, we look at the older part of this double helix, anti-Semitism, which has taken so many shapes and forms in the past 2,000 years. It has transformed from the Christian propaganda of John Chrysostom, or John the Golden Mouth, who was a prolific hater of the Jews in the 4th century, through the fervent anti-Semitism of the religious reformer Martin Luther, to the political, social, and economic anti-Semitism of the early modern times, into the racial ideology of the 20th century. Gosh, who do we even highlight there? Most of Europe and North America? If you're interested in this historical background, check out the reading list we publish along with the episode, because today we discuss the current state of affairs. And in our next episode, we will deal with anti-Muslim racism. Many of us were taught that after the unprecedented horrors of the Holocaust, Europe has vowed to never again allow for such hate to build up. That has led to this egregious industrialized genocide. Indeed, there have been great efforts to uproot this nasty prejudice, but it never disappeared entirely. In fact, anti-Semitic sentiments are rising in Europe once again, and since this show is an Austrian-Hungarian co-production, we definitely have a lot of baggage to account for. But what is anti-Semitism today? Already choosing a definition can be a political question. According to the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or even non-Jewish individuals and/or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Does that mean that one mustn't criticize Israel's government either? That seems to be the position of Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, but I'm wary of any government claiming that they are one with an entire people. You know, I'm Hungarian.
Hello.
And I'm especially allergic to the use of religion to justify political violence. I was raised Catholic, you see. Don't you give me none of that pouting, Pope Urban II. with your crusade kicking off 2 centuries of pointless massacres, upsetting a region that is still in turmoil today? Get out of here! Bad Pope! Bad Pope! But let's get back to the point. According to the Austrian government's website, criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic if it's comparable to that level that other states. Now that sounds workable, except when anti-Semitism is on the rise again and hate groups exploit any occasion and any loophole to fearmonger and scapegoat. So, how do we tell criticism and hate apart? And how does one start to get informed on the topic? Let us try and open the door with this conversation with a fantastic set of speakers. Professor Helga Embacher is a historian at the University of Salzburg with a focus on National Socialism, Jewish history, Israel, and anti-Semitism. Johann Kneis has been a journalist since 1980, and in the past few years he's also active in the programming of 2 music festivals in Austria, Glatt und Verkehrt and the newly created festival Jewish Weekends in St. Pölten. Lidia Cesin-Jurek is an assistant professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Stockton University. She's a Polish historian and author currently working in New Jersey. Her research spans the memory of the Holocaust and the Gulag, as well as forced migration and refugee movements in historical and contemporary contexts. Today we are hosted by the Alte Schmiede Kunstverein in Vienna and by the György Sebestyén Austrian Library in Budapest. Thanks so much for joining me here today and over here from New Jersey today. So let's talk about this very uplifting, nice and rosy topic that's extremely easy to address, anti-Semitism in Europe. Isn't it the best? I want to start with you, Helga, if you don't mind, because you've published extensively on what you termed as 21st century anti-Semitism. So many of us are familiar with some versions, some forms, the running jokes, the jabs, the comments aside, the animosity that is sort of historical anti-Semitism. What's new in the 21st century?
The debate actually about new anti-Semitism and what's new on the new anti-Semitism started in the year 2001. When the second Intifada was transferred into Europe. And there were clashes between Arabs and Jews, mainly in France, but also in the Netherlands and to a lesser extent in the UK. And with that, the debate started. Mainly, it started actually in the US, what's very interesting. And it was not an academic debate, it was more run by journalists. And the question was, what is new? Some people thought or demanded it's the same like in the 1930s, and we are shortly before new Holocaust. But then more and more academicians took part in this debate. It was also very emotional within the academic milieu, and I think there's not too much new about anti-Semitism in the 20th century. The debate focused on 2 main subjects or 2 main actors, the left and Muslims. So I think there was hardly anything new among the left. New social groups took part now because they were founded, like Black Lives Matters in 1910, or the parts of the Green Party, part of feminists. But the stereotypes, the images of Israel were the same, anti-Zionist and kind of this post-colonial view on Israel, this very actually simple analysis of the Middle East conflict. But then what was actually new was that Muslims went into the streets. We don't know what they thought before, but that they manifested anti-Semitism in the streets. And here it's very interesting that it started in France. And there were no demonstrations, for example, by Turkish people in Germany or in Austria. It's hard to use because the Muslim society or Muslims in Europe is a very heterogeneous society. And it's not, they are not, it was always interesting for me, when are they ready to go into the streets for Israel? And what for the Palestinians, and what do Palestinians symbolize for them? So these were the 2 main subjects where the debate was focusing on, and I think a mistake was that this debate neglected right-wing anti-Semitism. I think it was much neglected as a problem. And for me, it's actually new that a very right-wing party changed from anti-Israel, anti-Jewish into very much pro-Israel and stylizing them as the protectors of the Jewish community. And I think the most interesting phenomena is the FPÖ, because like in 2009 there was a Gaza war. The FPÖ took sides with Hamas. And in 2010, Strache went to Israel and tried to become the best friend of Israel.
I mean, we always talk about how you should be ready to change your mind, right? The FPÖ seems to symbolize that on high speed. I'm not sure that this is exactly that kind of blend that I would be seeking. Lydia, you are Polish and you work in the US right now. So that's a strong juxtaposition between two culturally extremely affected communities. How do you see this?
Both in the USA and in Europe and in Poland, everywhere, what is the most puzzling for all of us is that Jews outside Israel are today broadly associated with Israeli politics and collectively somehow blamed for the oppression of Palestinians and the ongoing conflict in Gaza. And I think this is, for us, discussing these issues of anti-Semitism, of a new anti-Semitism, spreading all over, let's say, the Western Hemisphere, something most puzzling. We would not be true to ourselves or to the lessons of history if we saw this rise of in violence and also intimidation against Jewish people as entirely unexpected. And this is this well-known historical pattern, scapegoating, right, based on shared identity and imagined collective culpability rather than on actions and beliefs of individuals. Unless one renounces or hides their Jewish identity, one is seen as part of the collective and thus a legitimate target for the anti-Semites. And these anti-Semites, they change. Because this is, of course, something paradoxical when happens in post-Holocaust European, let's say, landscape universe or Euro-Atlantic cultural sphere, which has long preached respect for human rights based on their violation during the Shoah. And again, anti-Semitism evolves, and Professor Embacher hinted at this evolution and changes. This anti-Jewish animosity in the West is no longer the domain of the far right only. It stems from new sources, and these sources are often uncomfortable to discuss. Plus, on a smaller scale, new research discovered, for example, that also for Russia might be complicit in instigating some small acts of anti-Semitic incident. But this all leaves us with the question, why does anti-Semitism in these new different forms and guises generally endure and can be used as a political weapon? And I think that here, in large part, these are the questions that social psychology gives answers to, and among them is this universal truth that it is far easier to blame a small, historically persecuted group than to confront complex geopolitical realities of today. So there is, for example, there are no anti-Russian riots or pogroms today, because we would not blame individual Russians living in since generations, for example, in the West, for their complicity in Putin's crimes in Ukraine. So what then is definitely troubling in the case of anti-Semitism is that its resurgence today on both sides of the Atlantic reveals a disturbing truth. Anti-Jewish sentiment or resentment manifests itself even in the regions which were seen or thought about themselves as postmodern, secular, progressive societies. And even if these old forms of prejudice, like religious, Christian, or nationalist, racial, largely have been discredited or simply out of place in modern kind of context or modern mindset, we still see that they continue to provide symbols like the Hakenkreuz on the wall, or some cultural codes like blood libel, for example, to these new forms of hostility towards Jews, which are seen today in Europe and in the US.
And in some cases, for instance, in the country where I'm from, in blatantly anti-Semitic political campaigns and then sort of tokenism to cover this up and say, yeah, but we support Israel, so we cannot possibly be anti-Semites, as if those were in contradiction. Now, if you like what you see, and if we manage to make you laugh at least once, please support our work and go to patreon.com/Eurozine. This is the magazine presenting this show. You can pledge as little as €5 a month or whatever you can afford, and you'll get access to bonus materials, early access, and even get to suggest topics and questions. I think we should come back also to the fact that for some reason, even the most anti-Semitic people don't want to be called anti-Semites, which I find a very interesting position on their parts. But before that, let's talk about your work, Johan, and your story, actually, because you engage with the most joyful part of Jewish culture.
We started a festival of Jewish music in a relatively small Austrian city, St. Pölten, a half hour from Vienna, in a former synagogue. So many questions in that context. What is Jewish music? Is it music that's composed by Jews? It's a valid answer. Is it music that comes out
So all of the Christmas songs from the US, yes.
A lot of them, actually, yes.
That's all Jewish music in that sense.
Irving Berlin wrote White Christmas. Or is it music that comes out of religious traditions, other cultural traditions? Who has the right to define what's Jewish music? To a lot of people in Austria, Jewish music is klezmer, music that has seen a beautiful revival starting in the late 1970s and 80s. And a lot of people tend to mystify Jewish culture, Jewishness, not necessarily with a negative intent at all. And what I and we intend to do with this festival is to get away from cliches and to present sort of the large spectrum of Jewish traditions, from the Renaissance and Baroque music to Sephardic traditions. I mean, music that evolved in Spain and Portugal, but later in the Ottoman Empire, up to and including contemporary music and experimental jazz. And why do I think that's important? I mean, you could say it's always important, it's enriching to have sort of to broaden your sense of what culture is. But I think it's also important to, especially in the case of Jewishness, to get away from mystifications, both positive and negative. And you mentioned my family background, I think.
If you don't mind.
You're hinted. No. I mean, it's something that I grew up with, being from a mixed family, Jewish on my mother's side, and my grandparents had to leave Austria in 1938. So when I grew up, I had a sense that it was somehow not good to speak about yourself being Jewish or having Jewish family. Personally, I was never confronted with like outright racism or anti-Semitism, but I've heard it from other people. And but you sense, you have a feeling as a child also. They have a feeling of what's appropriate and what's part of what's seen as normal, quote unquote, and what's seen as not so normal. And I think we have a long way to go to acknowledge being Jewish in a religious sense or in a different sense as being normal in Germany and Austria. And even with well-meaning people. That's what I meant before.
Especially.
Yeah, even with well-meaning people.
You spent a portion of your childhood in Iceland, right? Before you guys moved to Austria.
My mother did. My mother grew up in Iceland. I was born here. I later spent some time in Iceland, but...
At least the Icelandic don't have much to bang on their chests about when it comes to genocides against the Jews. Do they?
Yes.
Oh my God, don't disappoint me, please.
Iceland hardly accepted refugees, except with very few exceptions. My grandparents were, and my mother's family were one of these exceptions.
Let's come to this notion that even those who are operating with what in the American context are often called dog whistles, that is not completely, so it's obvious to those in the know, but kind of harder to factually prove that this is anti-Semitic campaigning. For instance, Hungarian government would put out billboards about György Soros, later his son Alex Soros, stylized as the evil puppet master, this kind of realm, which is like obviously operating with all the anti-Semitic tropes that would be in fashion throughout the 30s or the 40s. How do we address this kind of peacock dance around the facts, which are sometimes completely obvious?
If we start with Hungary, actually what they do there with George Soros is a classic conspiracy theory or narrative that goes back to the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, the so-called Verschwörung. And Conspiracy, yeah. It was invented, we know it was a fake actually, long before the Nazis, and it was spread out by Ford, by the automobile owner in America. He translated all these pamphlets, and I think it's a code now. But I'm not sure that everybody understands who Soros is, what's exactly going on. And anti-Semitism very often works with codes. And now I think, especially in the US, Soros is the classic conspiracy. Elon Musk, for example, believes in it or uses it, or instrumentalizes it.
Because you mentioned Ford, I started thinking, if you are an ultra-rich auto manufacturer, are you doomed to be an insane conspiracy theorist? Because there seems to be a tendency there. But so just to amend this, actually, the talking points and the discourse demonizing Soros was adopted from the US far right. So this is not invented in Hungary. It was first used from 2014 against the NGOs and civil society supported by Soros, and then applied with huge luck in the refugee crisis. So it actually, weirdly, an American import to a European country that has its own horrific history with anti-Semitism, so that's even more bewildering
but
to
what
me.
I would think is so actually weird, but we also can explain it. It seems weird that these right-wing parties, extreme right parties, use these conspiracy theories. Theories, actually the wrong term, narratives we can say. And on the other hand, they are close friends to Netanyahu. So this is an interesting phenomenon. You can be, let's say, philo-Semitic on one hand, but on the other hand, you are a follower, use or instrumentalize conspiracy narratives.
I think that we shouldn't also forget that the main thing happening also now in the West vis-a-vis Jewish people is kind of shift in the victimhood and solidarity discourses. I'm sure you have read about it already. Like Jews are placed today again on the wrong side of history, also from other, let's say, camps, unexpected camps. And this shift today is closely tied to the broadening definition of who counts and who qualifies as a victim and on what grounds. And in this current constellation, Jews have been kind of repositioned away from the paradigmatic victims of Nazi racism to the very opposite, to the symbols of white race. And Soros, he's like this epitome, the symbol of that. And Jews are also increasingly understood today as, of course, colonizing settlers in Palestine, right? And like an anachronistic outpost of the West in the Arab world, and thus also as kind of Western guilty conscience, given the post-colonial narratives. So Jews, historically part of the coalition of marginalized groups, are now in this thinking being cast as part of the oppressor class, which has shifted the dynamics of solidarity and the justice in ways that are politically complicated. I'm sure that you've noticed that European liberals today are struggling as well, including those in Germany, Scandinavia, the Netherlands, and Austria, because this direction of reckoning and remembrance has had clear objectives, clear villains and evils to combat, shaping kind of commitment to non-discriminatory principles in the public sphere, which, however, today means not only venerating the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, but also counteracting discrimination as such, right? Including against, very importantly, Muslim immigrant minority to Europe. So liberal and green parties are very committed to combat anti-Semitism, and at the same time, they would not confront it as for example, a Muslim issue, which it to a considerable extent also is, because they recognize the Muslim minority in Europe, not without good reasons, of course, as another vulnerable group in need of protection. For instance, and this is very often brought up in media coverage of attacks carried out by some extremists from Muslim minority backgrounds, journalists often hesitate to mention the attacker's religious affiliation out of a concern for stoking further hatred and prejudice against broader Muslim population. This caution, of course, is a responsible approach to take.
I suppose that it will not be able to effectively combat anti-Semitism without, at the same time, addressing issues of racism in general and of also anti-Muslim racism for various reasons, on principle, but also for pragmatic reasons, because when people in the Muslim communities in Austria, for instance, if they feel that they're kind of second-class citizens, that there's some kind of suspicion against all of them because they have a Muslim background or because their parents come from Egypt or wherever, or Syria, you know, it's easy for them to be in a sort of feel victimized, and it's easy for them to hold on to pictures of you know, Jews being preferred or being privileged, etc., etc. So I think it's quite important to address issues of social justice as well as issues of you know, human rights, basically.
Even if there's a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe, let's say most of the governments are more sensitive to anti-Semitism than to racism.
Yeah.
You can say a lot against Muslims, but you can't publicly say as much against Jews. And this, I think, causes the competition between these two minorities. Also after October 7, I think there was hardly any empathy for Palestinian civilian suffering. And what I also wanted to add, I think it's very interesting now to see how Jewish communities developed due to this very complicated situation they are in. On one hand, anti-Zionism or anti-Semitism from the left, and on the other hand, right-wing anti-Semitism, especially in France during the last elections they had. So this is a very complicated situation, and especially in the USA, in the United States, we see that like 20% of the Jewish people support Trump, even if he is very anti-Semitic and blames Jews who vote for the Democratic Party are kind of meshuggah or responsible if he loses the elections, and it is just, is it even worse? But so we can see that Jews move more and more to the right.
I think it's a huge problem that we conceptualize victimhood as a traveling trophy that's going to walk around. And of course, I come from a country whose national ideology is about us being the ultimate victims. And there's also a competition between all the Abrahamic religions of being the chosen people. What you also mentioned, Lydia, that Jews have moved, or I should say the image of Jewish people has moved from this racially othered group to the privileged white people. I think that's a very easy substitution, because there was always an ideology about Jews both being the drag and the poor and the dirty, but at the same time the elite. So I think it's actually a very easy switch and bait in the discourse, which I don't know how this should be combated, but I would really love for that to happen. But sometimes I have the impression that especially those with a more sort of inclination to engage with a little bit of racism, a little bit of hate politics, because it's kind of, in our culture. I feel like some of them have drawn the wrong lessons from the Second World War and the genocide against the Jews, the Roma, gay political dissidents, but also all the genocides since. Because at least in the moderate right, I feel like, and especially in the far right, the lesson that they took away seems to be that we shouldn't openly hurt the Jews because that's going to be bad for us. Does this check out in your experience? It's just a lay observation.
Yeah, I very much agree with you, with all you have said, including this notion of, at the beginning, and I will quote here the Viennese scholar Ruth Wodak, Judeus ex machina, right? Jews will be, there will be this fabrication of a figure of Jew for whatever current purpose to explain the ills of the world. I wanted to also come back to what Helga said before about a Jewish response and also shifting attitudes among Jewish community to what happens today. Because I encountered many people telling me about the sense of shock at how swiftly the position of Jews has shifted within this broader landscape of solidarity with victims that we have just discussed. So this argument of the Holocaust singularity, despite its limitations, which have been highlighted in ongoing debates, historical debates, setting crimes against Jews in historical relation to colonial crimes, but this argument helped position Jews as a dominant archetype of victimhood. And this status may have fostered a sense of envy, given the prominent place Jewish memorials occupy, for example, in public space, especially in the West. It left the Jewish community, particularly in the US, more than in Europe, I think, largely unchallenged for a time, this singularity paradigm. And it led to a certain complacency. Now, however, as we see, Jews can no longer afford this sense of complacency. And after living relatively peacefully for nearly 2 generations, especially again in the US, they are once again forced to adopt a more defensive stance. But what is very important to say is that within the Jewish community, there are also vocal intellectuals who warn that Jews may be jeopardizing their own safety by supporting, for example, today Israel's retaliatory policies in Gaza and settlement expansion. But I think that in the context of our conversation, very importantly, it is important to emphasize that Jewish people are far from consensus on what is happening in Israel or what is happening in terms of this rising tide of intimidation, anti-Jewish intimidation, and the refusal to acknowledge this diversity of opinion within the Jewish community by those who attack Jews indiscriminately simply for them being Jewish reveals again the very essence of anti-Semitism we are confronting and discussing.
In this episode, we are hosted by the Alte Schmiede Kunstverein in Vienna and by the György Sebestyén Austrian Library in Budapest. At the Alte Schmiede, which was designed from a literal old blacksmith's workshop, you find a literary salon that presents literary talks, concerts, all sorts of gatherings, and the program is entirely for free. Thank you to them and the György Sebestyén Austrian Library in Budapest for hosting us. Andrássy University offers German language higher education in Hungary, giving its students coming from all walks of international life dual German and Hungarian degrees. The university offers interdisciplinary master and PhD programs in economics, law, political science, and history. Now back to the program.
I'm very glad that Lydia, that you just mentioned also what you see as the core of anti-Semitism. There's an aspect of generalization, but also to me that it combines with what you said before about this kind of irrational, all kinds of who knows what Jews are up to, and all the conspiracy ideas, and we will be punished, you know, if we're too anti-Semitic. We can be a little bit anti-Semitic, but if we're too anti-Semitic, we might be punished, and sort of this idea that they're Jews with a lot of wealth and a lot of power somewhere. And I mean, that's being used a lot in politics, also not only in Hungary, but also in Austria several years ago when, you know, when there was talk of the East Coast and everybody, nobody said Jews, but everybody knew what was meant. And to me, that's very fascinating, but also in a way disheartening, the way these notions keep existing. And
many people don't know about what really happened in the Holocaust anymore. Like my students, I have to confess, we failed. Also in schools, we have to rethink the Holocaust education, I think. And it's all about feelings. It's about, I think, I supervised a dissertation, and it turned out that many Muslim students went to Mauthausen, very much identified with the suffering of the Jews, and on the other hand, they posed all kinds of terrible stereotypes or anti-Semitic tropings about Israel. So it's feelings, it's to be, and I think it's all about being on the right side. It's like being anti-Zionist. Zionism is a code for the evil, and being anti-Zionist is being on the right side. And it's a kind of bundle of prejudice or images you have to belong to.
Yeah, but I think it's especially hard for young people and children, let's say teenagers, because you first start to engage with political ideas for real beyond what you're taught at home, but there's, especially in the questions of Palestine and Israel, so much bottled up anger and so much that the wider context around you, or let's say mainstream European discourse, is just not willing to contend with whatsoever. We just don't talk about these things. There's very little, about the whole historical background, not just the Holocaust. I went through public education with relatively good grades, knowing nothing about, these mass pogroms in my closer region. And there's people expecting you to take a position when you're not primed for this in a toxic discourse that forces you into a corner.
And even the Middle East conflict, it's more complicated, I would say, than the Holocaust. It's complicated for me, and I've been reading about that. So how do I teach students, even students, it's hard to teach about the Middle East conflict, about the creation of Israel, about the immigration to Palestine, about all the wars, to be not one-sided. It's very complicated, but I think this is very important to think about. How can we reach people, young people now, and get them away from only being emotionalized? But on the other hand, it's so full of emotions.
For all of us, if we think about the future, a very important thing to consider in our daily lives, also in our professional lives, to address this complexity of the situation, both during the Holocaust and today, because there is this deepening rupture caused by October the 7th massacre and also Israel's subsequent response. And in many ways, for example, Hamas achieved what it set out to do. It radicalized Israeli government in a way that had not been seen before, drawing us into kind of a stark black and white framework of being either for or against. But we must acknowledge that we do not have adequate knowledge sometimes to take sides on this matter. We have to try to keep the space for dialogue, which has dramatically shrunk in the Middle East. But we must strive to keep it open here in Europe and also in the US. Part of maintaining this space involves recognizing that defending Jewish rights does not automatically equate to supporting the Israeli government. So in the field of education, which is my field, there is so much to be done beyond simply increasing the Holocaust education. We must really focus on creating the conditions for more informed conversations, as Helga mentioned, because there are so many clouded, misleading tropes in these topics. It's essential for us to continue to explain how hatred operates as such, whether it is in the form of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or any type of bigotry.
Thank you so much. And I really honestly think we always say you have to understand the history behind this for everything. You don't have time for all the conflicts in your entire life, but this particularly is a situation where you really can't deal just with the present moment. And I would argue, as somebody who, didn't get this whole thing in public school or through sort of regular education, it's not that hard to catch up. Like, you don't have to remember all the dates in order to generally understand the picture.
The same approach of openness and informed discussion should extend beyond education in all other areas of public life, especially media communication. And responsible media, right, plays a crucial role in shaping how we understand and discuss these present issues. And I really sincerely hope that the work we are doing here today at Standard Time contributes to this effort.
Jewish life can only develop in democracy, and we also need democracy. And if we look into schools and young people who we know from polls, democracy is not the highest in the ranking. And we should never forget to combine fighting against anti-Semitism. It means also fighting for democracy and fighting against politicians who want illiberal democracies.
Thank you so much. Now, we want to know what you think. Where do you draw the line between criticism and hate? How do you initiate a discussion on this topic? Is it something you'd bring up at a family gathering? Let us know in the comment. And while you're rummaging down there, please give us a like, subscribe to the channel, and maybe share it with your friends. We also ask you to be respectful and considerate with your words in the comments. This talk show is presented by Eurozine, and if you haven't heard of it, you should check it out right now, because this online magazine trades in a scarcity item, and that's insight. Eurozine publishes thoughtful long-form articles from more than 100 partner journals across dozens of European languages, and you have access to it all for free. Display Europe is the force behind this project. It's a content-sharing platform that offers you articles, podcasts, and videos about European politics and culture in 15 different languages. And yes, it also doesn't abuse your user data. I know, it's unbelievable. Go check them out at displayeurope.eu. This program is co-funded by the Creative Europe program of the European Union and the European Cultural Foundation. Importantly, the views and opinions expressed here are those of the speakers and the authors only. They do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or the European Education and Culture Executive Agency. Neither the European Union nor the EACAA can be held responsible for them. Not that we would mind them taking advice from us or anything.